The Common Groundwater podcast is brought to you by CalSec, an international company headquartered in Kalamazoo that provides expertly crafted ingredients that help food and beverages look better, taste better, and last longer, all naturally. CalSec has set aggressive goals to send zero waste to landfills by 2030 and to create net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. You can learn more at calsec.com. Hey folks, you are tuning into Common Groundwater, a podcast by the Michigan Environmental Council, where we talk about environmental issues that are felt widely and deeply across the state. We talk about stories around them and then solutions to them. I'm Beau, Brockett, your host, and I'm joined today in the new year to start our second round of the podcast series with Reese Dillard, our water policy specialist at the Environmental Council.
Thanks for having me, Beau.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thanks for kicking things off. And so you're kicking off the first podcast episode of 2025. You're here today to talk water issues with us. Mm-hmm. This is the latest episode in the Polluter Rulebook miniseries that, if you have tuned in, you might be familiar with, where we talk about some sorts of like frozen protections around our statewide Environmental Protection Act. Before we get into all of that, though, I would be remiss not to continue a streak I've had going in this mini-series. Given that we're talking water today, could you share a little bit about your favorite water feature here in Michigan, lake or stream that you have?
Yeah, so I'd have to say that my favorite lake is Lake Michigan. I visited in a variety of different places, like Sawyer, Michigan for the Warren Sand Dunes, Saugatuck, Muskegon, and something that I love so much about Lake Michigan is like how diverse the shoreline is, and you can go to all these different places and see all these different unique features that you don't see in the other locations.
I like that. A big grand answer, Lake Michigan, to close out the Polluter Rulebook mini-series, so I like it. I will spare the audience more ramblings about my favorite lakes and streams, which I've shared on 3 episodes already. As I kind of mentioned at the start of the episode, during the Polluter Rulebook miniseries, we talked about the ways in which environmental protections around our water that you would think Michigan has, we haven't had as much because of some freezings of law, some muddying up of procedures. The big thing that we talked about was what we call Part 31. Just to familiarize our audience again, it's been a half year since we had our last episode on this. Could you talk at a higher level as to what Part 31 is and how it's been frozen?
Yeah, so what we call Part 31 is actually one part of this incredibly lengthy document called the Natural Resources Environmental Protection Act, or for short, NREPA. And while the larger document guidelines the conservation of Michigan's resources and regulates the use of land, water, and other natural resources in the state, Part 31 of that document is one of the most fundamental laws that dictates water quality protections in the state. It's meant to regulate how we control our wastewater discharge, establish standards for the storage and monitoring of harmful contaminants, authorize the issue of pollutant discharge permits, and so much more. And under that same section, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, or more commonly known as EGLE, is obligated to oversee that the quality of the water of our state is protected. Unfortunately, the agency is unable to do so because of language that was added to Part 31 and took effect in 2006. And that language essentially prohibits EGLE from promulgating new rules. And so now what we have is a single sentence essentially stands in the way of EGLE adequately protecting the waters of our state because they can not promulgate additional rules that reflect all of the updated and new science that we've found or discovered within the past 2 decades, essentially. So here we are, kind of left behind the rest of the nation as new information about environmental protections come out. With Part 31 during the previous legislative session, MEC and other environmental organizations alike advocated for a bill both in the House and Senate that would simply strike that language that's so harmful and damaging and doesn't allow Eagle to effectively protect the waters of the Great Lakes state.
Great. Wonderful summary. Thank you. An unfortunate summary that it has to be shared, but a great one. I mentioned this, I think, earlier on in this mini-series, but it's a bit staggering to think how much has changed since 2006. Like, you and I were in elementary school then.
Yeah.
and from a water perspective, like, the Flint water crisis hadn't happened. The extent of, like, PFAS or microplastics weren't fully known. Mm-hmm. And now, because of, like, this extra sentence added to Part 31 that's kind of frozen things in time, our environmental department, Eagle, isn't able to always properly protect us from the pollutants, even though it may want to. You've worked on this issue since, for about 2 years now. Mm-hmm. Have there been any, like, particularly concerning, like, examples of Part 31 kind of, like, preventing good progress on pollution from happening?
I do find it particularly troubling that this language prevents Eagle from updating a list that regulates the storage, spill prevention, and notification of accidents, including certain materials. And much like you just mentioned, PFAS, something that we have discovered the harmful effects of some time ago, it's unable to be added to a list of nearly 1,000 other chemicals that pose a risk to human health. And at this moment, it's something that we see so often in news articles and notices about PFAS being found in many of our household items, the clothes we wear, cookware that we use, all these different sources. So we find more instances of this material being improperly disposed of. And what's so troubling about this is that our state has invested a tremendous amount of resources and money towards researching and identifying and treating and cleaning up PFAS, but this very mundane thing that you typically wouldn't think about is something that Eagle is unable to do in order to effectively protect the people, the animals, the environment, the waters of the state.
Yeah. When I spoke with Megan Tinsley, our water policy director, on this mini-series in mid-2024, progress around Part 31 had just been starting to pick up in the Michigan legislature. Could you give us a bit of information on, like, what you and other advocates have been doing, what's happened since then?
Sure. So I'd first like to say, like, all of this work wouldn't have been possible without the two forefront bill sponsors we had, Senator Sue Shink and House Representative Emily Devendorf. After these bills were introduced, the Environmental Council and some of our partners, like For Love of Water and Sierra Club, advocated for these bills and offered testimony during committee meetings and really highlighted the simplicity of the bill while also explaining the critical nature of granting this authority back to Eagle. And there are actually two people that I wanted to highlight because of their efforts on this. Carrie LeSueur, who is the legal director for Flow, gave incredibly in-depth analysis of the litigation that Michigan potentially opens itself up to because we're falling out of compliance. To Carrie's point, it's really troubling to see the Great Lakes state, this ecological wonder in peril just because of this language.
Yeah.
Someone else who I also wanted to champion is Christy McGillivray from Sierra Club.
Yep, she kicked off the series, yeah.
And she was just a leading voice in underscoring the importance of restoring rulemaking authority to Eagle. So altogether, like you said, this was nearly a 2-year effort where we worked very hard to inform our legislators on the importance of this issue and its wide-reaching impacts. But ultimately, during the lame duck session, we saw the legislature's inability to pass this really straightforward, common sense legislation, which allowed these bills to die. However, it's my personal hope that this isn't the end of the Part 31 issue, and we'll be able to bring this back to the table maybe in future years to come.
Okay. Well, first I have to say, so sorry to you and Megan and the folks at Flow and Sierra Club, just for all that effort. And, the Rep Devendorf, Senator Schenck, I know how much effort was put into this, and how common sense it really is, right? It was a big bummer, so I'm sorry for you all, and sorry for the state of Michigan, too. But it is good to hear that there's hope, that you have hope for this policy in the future, especially just given, that at the federal level, things are a bit uncertain as to how strong water protections will be valued. When we look at the next year or two ahead, we have a new Michigan legislature, a new federal administration even. You talked about having hope for Part 31. What's ahead for this advocacy effort for you, others at the Environmental Council, other allies of ours?
Unfortunately, it's our understanding that this legislature has less of an appetite for some of the environmental conservation legislation that we at MEC have been pursuing, and some of our other advocacy groups have been pursuing. So, with Part 31, even though it is one of the more straightforward bills that I've ever seen, it is seriously a very short document, very quick read. It's not something that we'll necessarily be deep diving in this legislative session, I don't believe. But with that being said, it is work that we think is critical to protecting Michigan and for the residents of the state. This work that we've already done is something that we would like to build upon in future years in order to secure these water protections for the state. While it may not be at the forefront of our minds right now, it's still something that we think is so important to our state and to the people here. So it's not an effort that we will just let slip away. Yeah.
Well, and to end it on a more hopeful note, perhaps, an even more hopeful note, what is on the top of your minds at this given moment? Are there any sorts of water issues or water solutions that you feel could be successful in Michigan in these next 2 years?
Definitely. I think the next 2 years we'll definitely have some interesting issues before us. And I think one thing that we'll be advocating for is finding alternatives to the large amount of salt that we apply to the road during the winter months to our icy streets. These large volumes of salt are not only costly for the state and for taxpayers and lead to premature rusting on our vehicles and may affect the used sale market or just lead to costly repairs. It's actually an incredible water quality concern because when the snow and ice melt, those road salts are carried directly into nearby lakes and streams. Oh. Similarly, as it melts, it just seeps into the groundwater. And we know that salt persists in the environment. It stays in soils and it stays in the water. And with that being said, it impacts the agricultural sector and also aquatic species who may not be able to adapt to those saltier conditions when they're used to freshwater. It may be something that many people don't even think about, but it is affecting them. And then an issue that we pursued last session is the protection of critical dunes. They're some of the most magnificent features that Michigan has to offer. Clearly, it's one of mine because I so much enjoy Lake Michigan and the dunes surrounding it. But after the 2012 Critical Dune Act was gutted, it's just vital now more than ever to protect these spaces that we love, that we recreate in, that we take respite in. And I guess not the final issue that we'll be working on, but something that we would like to work on is limiting the large water withdrawals from data centers. And again, this is an issue that already came up last legislative session, but we'll continue work on into this administration. Just as we see AI usage and internet usage in general go up across the country, there's a demand for centers that can store all of the data that's collected. And I think we at MEC, as well as many other advocacy groups, just want to make sure that we're not seeing the negative impacts of these large water withdrawals, like water scarcity or increased water pollution. So, yeah, a little bit of defense and really just trying to make sure the waters of the state are protected in any way we can, despite Eagle not being able to adequately do so. But there's things we can definitely do.
I think some of these issues you mentioned are like very universally like thought about, right? Like we love our dunes. We don't like road salt coming into our homes, let alone into our waters. So that gives me hope. So thanks for sharing.
It's important not to get bogged down in all of the negative things that we hear, and instead get creative with what we can do. To make sure that we as a people, our land, our water, and all these different spaces are protected for years to come.
That's great. Well, I think that's a great way to close out our episode. Reese, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, despite the bad news you had to share. I really do appreciate it. And just for having that perspective, I think on the work ahead, it really means a lot. So I appreciate you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it further and just be here and have the conversation. For sure.
Well, and thank you too to our audience for tuning in on this episode. We'll have other Where Are They Now episodes up ahead that you can also tune into and get a sense of where things are at from some of the past topics we talked about. Thank you finally to CalSec, our sponsor for this podcast series. They're a B Corporation in Kalamazoo. With that, take care, and we'll see you around.